as that is going, I'll add in and move on to our land acknowledgement. And I do have a link in the chat or my notes about national parks and Native Americans, so I'll put that in for us. Okay, I do see that we have someone new, so I'll go ahead and close the chat and say, I mean, the poll and say welcome. So let me go ahead and close that. And so we will make sure that we acknowledge and recognize everyone who's new with us and invite everyone to contribute and make sure we have all of the options for everyone to be contributing and joining in. So I got triggered by the word acknowledgement there, recognizing that our land acknowledgements are not a substitute for relationships and action, but they can begin to point toward deeper possibilities for decolonizing relationships with people and place. We also start with a recognition of the pain and trauma from over 400 years of racism in the United States. And it's a pledge to or acknowledgement of the intersectionality of those who identify both as persons of color and individuals with disabilities. And it's a commitment to centering our work to dismantling systemic racism and disrupting ableist structures. These are our goalposts today, which the practical strategy from this slide is, and this is something I'm trying to impart and really infuse through to make sure I'm explicit about things. And I think that's one of the things as we're teachers are really hard to do, is to make what's in our head explicit for everyone else. So these guideposts are things that can be helpful for our students to know, hey, okay, you're getting a handout here. This is something, an opportunity for us to engage. That's the activity or something to do, whether it's via in chat box or on the screen, or whether it's into breakout rooms. We're going to pause so we can reflect and think about how this applies to our work. We're going to provide resources and links for you as well. And so these are our guideposts today, as well as throughout the series. We have some Zoom tips. When I know most of you have already changed your name on your Zoom name so that we can see who you are and where you are. But if you haven't yet done that, please go ahead and change it so then it's your name and your district. You can do that by accessing your participants list, going to your name, and then choosing the rename option there. The mute button is for engaging. So obviously you are all muted upon entry, but you can unmute at any time. And the reactions is where you'll find the raised hand button, because unless you are one of the 6 whom I can see, I can't see if you do this. I can see Jill, Tammy, Nina, Jennifer, Lori, and Deborah. Otherwise, I'm going to have to scroll through. And if you talk, you come into the main 6. But if otherwise, please raise your electronic hand to contribute or get into the queue. The view options, it will be for annotating. And that's where you can, or you can also put us up along the top or along the side. You can slide your view over. And that's also where you can find the annotations so that you can draw on the screen, or you can change the color of whatever you're drawing with. So this is the first opportunity to use that, although I didn't put an engagement opportunity here. I should, because I'm adjusting and inviting here as well. And that is if you want to take a moment to stamp or annotate, highlight, underline, which one of these speaks to you, maybe particular today. This morning I was with a group of SLPs and somebody brought up the courageous leadership rather than the growth mindset. And I like that as well. So I'll give you a moment with that. And if I have to let my dog out, I apologize. We'll be juggling things today. Thank you for contributing. You can also put things into the chat. Okay. All righty. Thank you. That gives everyone a moment to settle in, rename. See, a couple people haven't yet renamed that. Welcome, Joni and Angela. Roxanne, I'm just going to put an FL after your name since I know that you are here joining us from Florida. Oh, wait, did you do that or did I? I don't know. All right, thank you all. That active engagement, so crucial, isn't it? So thank you for your engagement. I'm going to go ahead and clear that off. I have my annotations on as well. And then give you the opportunity as well here, as we think about how to engage with each other, that we speak openly, listen openly. Thank you, Angela. I don't know if you can do annotations on, of course, people who need to leave early. Oh, that reminds me, I will need to get the attendance link for you as well. Just need to put in the attendance, your name and the attendance link once. It will mark the time that you do so. And if people need to leave early, do what else? I mean, this kind of goes perfect segue into this one here, giving ourselves and each other grace. And that did not turn out well as a heart, but I'd like somebody put in one of these. This is the most important thing right now. We have a lot going on. The weather is beckoning us or making us itchy or a little bit of both. So hence we understand we take care of your needs. We're all adults. Let's do what we need to do. All right. So these are the goals of our series. We've talked about these many times, but we do have someone new. So just recognizing that we're looking to deepen our understanding of explicit systematic instruction, how that applies to teaching our emergent readers as well as those who struggle. Looking at all of the elements of literacy. Last time we talked about phonology. Today we're starting into orthography. Etymology we will be talking about starting today, but much more when we talk about morphology, syntax, semantics, all the understandings about what we need to learn to read, and how we can gain strategies to support our struggling learners as well as our emergent learners. Okay, so that's just an opportunity, since you saw a little bit about the outline of the goals. This is where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And at this point, I want to just pause and give you the opportunity to raise hand or put something in the chat box that you have thought about or been stewing on, or something that's been circling in your head, or a point that from one of our previous sessions that you'd like to draw attention to. For example, today I was listening to the second bonus episode of Sold the Story. Lori, was that just released last week? I think I'm seeing you nodding. So I thought that was very interesting on some caveats and some cautions and some appreciations that this is a hard work, and this is a 14-hour series. That's a mini version of a 42-hour series, and even then we can be doing more and more and more. I mean, I've been. You should see all the books around me. That's a continuous learning piece. So is there anyone who would like to unmute and bring up something that's been circling for you or new learning you've done? Thanks, Lori. Oh, I didn't know there was a re-release of a few. So if those of you who haven't seen Sold a Story, feel free. It's definitely an interesting listen, as well as all of Emily Hanford's reporting. Spelling programs, Rachel. Yes. Well, that's what we're getting into today. Yes. And there's so much to do. So unless someone's going to stop me, we'll get into it.
Can you repeat what you were saying? Sold?
Sure.
Are you saying sold the story?
Yes, I am. People have been putting it in the chat as well. I can go actually to here and grab it for you if we just, get my mouse instead of my writing. It's called Sold a Story. It's by American Public Media, and Emily Hanford had done previously a whole bunch of other reporting on reading, and this particular series was about the 3 cueing method and how it became very prevalent despite a lack of research. And I really appreciate, so another one said The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading. Is that the one with Chris? Let's see, the art. Somebody could put that one in. The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading. I have a book called that, and I wonder if it's the same guy. Teaching Primary Reading. Is it I'm only seeing books. So there's a podcast with that as well. Thanks, Lori. There we go. We can add that. Oh, it is Christopher Such. That was the book I was thinking of. And I'm not an Apple person. I'll just see if I can find it on my as well. Thank you for that. So just other opportunities to learn. There is a Science of Reading podcast. You'll see in my Padlet that I included. And for those of you who are new, I will put this, the Padlet is linked by my structured literacy instruction resources, and I'll put that link into the chat box for you. I've been rechecking some of the links as here we are to this doc. And that's where you can have everything. Thank you, Lori. Oh, I don't think that's clickable, what I gave you. Let me try that again. Copy URL. Here we go. There we go. All right. So there's a lot to do. So let's jump right in. We're going to start with some of the introductions. And I'm going to give you the Jamboard where you can jump in with your own introductions of who you are and where you are. Hopefully this is the right Jamboard because you never know on things, but we'll check it too as I talk. So that link, the QR code should take us there, but let's put it here for us as well. And we'll put that there, make our Jamboard. So I asked who's new with this class, but I didn't ask who's new with classes with me, but I can be brief. I've been teaching, I started teaching kids with dyslexia in 2001. So I was a dyslexia teacher, and then I became a dyslexia parent. So I've been on both sides of the IEP. I've been doing professional development for 7 years. Prior to that, I taught higher ed and taught people to become teachers. So I've taught myself elementary, middle, then high, then higher ed, and I've had so very variable experiences. But I think the most powerful one is when you teach someone, regardless of their level, something new. And when you have the teachers come back and say, I taught a student something you taught me, and it made a difference in their lives. And that's the most powerful thing for me, is helping others help others. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. So you can see here in our map of who we have. I'm going to add in, I saw Roxanne, who's joining us from Florida. If you haven't used, I'll put her way down here. If you haven't used Jamboards before, you can see we navigate with our little arrows here at the top. And we have our, create a new sticky note, and then you can add other things, but those are the most important ones for now. We also have a parking lot here for questions and points. And so this is one that we've discussed in the past, but feel free to add at any time. And we had some things that we talked about last time. And when you're in breakout rooms, I'll make sure that we get to anything we'll be exploring today. Okay. But before doing so, one of the questions I asked you in the first session was how many people had done a simulation about what it feels like to struggle to read? And many of you had not. So one of the ones that I like to do, and this comes from Rick Lavoie's Fat City, is a visual perception simulation. Jennifer, you look like you're nodding. Have you done this one before? You're muted.
We did it with you.
Oh, perfect. Then I'll skip it. Yay. I must have put it in 2 different places because of 2 different sessions. Fantastic. We can jump into the sound symbol correspondences because there's a lot to do here. So those of you who haven't done it before, thank you, Deborah, you've done the count. If you haven't done it, if you're somebody new and you missed that day with us, we'll share with you the recordings from the previous sessions. Okay, so jumping into our sound symbol correspondences. This was from a survey from the participants. If you haven't done the survey, I'm actually going to jump to where we shared it with you in the very beginning, so that I can make sure that I can get as many people as possible during the survey. So let me put it in here for you into the chat box, as well as you have already got the resources for the explicit literacy instruction. So let me put the survey into the chat. And what you're seeing in front of you wrong one. Are the results from this group. So we had phonologic, here we go. Nope, sorry, miswrote. Phonemes, vowels, that was all from last time. Here we go, sound symbol correspondences. So We have quite a variety in those of you who've completed the survey, from people at the upper end to people in the lower end, and a lot in between. So just as a reminder that the lower end was that you feel more comfortable with this topic, and the higher end was you are less comfortable with this topic. Nope, the other way around. Sorry, it's been a long day. As I asked for grace. So the number 10s mean you have a lot of comfort and knowledge. 1 was not as much comfortable in knowledge. But the point is, take a look at our heterogeneous group. So when you're in small groups, let's keep in mind that we have people to learn from, and we have to have people to teach. And that's very representative of life, isn't it? Okay, so before we get into the sound symbol correspondence, we're just going to have a reminder of the phonology, because we need to connect our phonemes and our understanding of phonemes to the symbols themselves. So this was a handout that I shared with you last time. Hopefully you've printed it and you have it with you. If not, you can bring it up. I'll show you how to get to the handouts again so you can access it. Because this is the left-hand side of David Kilpatrick's table. We're going to be talking about the right-hand side today. So back to our structured literacy handouts I gave you. We're going to these Dyslexia 101 handouts. I'll put that link in the chat box for you. Link. And we're going to the David Kilpatrick table. Things aren't going too slowly today. We can always think that, right? Okay, it's called the Kilpatrick chart. My apologies. So on the left is the phonological development. On the right is the reading development. So that's where we're going next, because the phonological development influences the reading development. And so on that right-hand side, if you don't have that table, you can just kind of take a snip and sketch of this, or take a screenshot of it. We're starting with the letter sound knowledge, and this includes our letter names and forms. Very often people talk about kids need to know their letters, and I always push back and say, do you mean the forms or the names or both? Because the reality is both, and I want to make sure people aren't forgetting that. So that knowledge supports my knowledge of how those letters represent sounds and vice versa, and how I can blend them to read real words. So this is looking at the letters, figuring out what sounds they make, and getting it to read real words. Then the orthographic mapping piece comes in. And I have a poll to engage everyone when we talk about engagement, to ask whether or not you are familiar with that term orthographic mapping. So I'll give you a moment with that. So far, we're getting everything. I was going to say started with more on the second one. We have some on the third. We have some everywhere, a little bit of everything. All right, we have 71% participation, not quite 80, but that's all right. The variety is still useful for us to see. I'll go ahead and poll and share the results with you. You can see we have someone who's never heard of it. It's a few who've heard of it, but not really sure about it. Some who have a vague idea, and some who are more comfortable. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing that. Now, the piece with orthographic mapping, this is what we need to be able to remember things. It's what we need to recode each time, so that we remember words instead of having to decode each time. It's dependent upon their proficiency with phonemes. I'm going to demonstrate it for you in just a moment. But I wanted to just take a moment to illustrate how these different skills are dependent upon each other. So the orthographic mapping, this is where spelling by analogy comes in a which is a well-researched approach. Orthographic mapping is a process, not a skill. There are skills you can teach kids to learn orthographic mapping, but this goes on implicitly in our readers as we learn to read. And so what happens, it's a process that we go through that allows us to remember words so we don't have to decode them in each time. So I'm going to draw a line here, because the top part of this is the phonic decoding that we go through. So this process of orthographic mapping, my students first see this word, and this is what they say. And perhaps they decode it first. Maybe they underline their vowels. Let me get my writing. They underline the vowel to recognize that this is an I. And they then translate each individual letter to its sound, to go from these what they see to what they say as sit. And here maybe they go I consonant E makes the long I, so this becomes sight. And IGH also represents a long I, so this is also sight. So they've sounded out this, what we might call a green flag word or a regular word, as well as these that have two different spellings of the same sound. I might call that yellow or even red if they haven't been exposed to those patterns yet. Okay, so that's my phonic decoding. Next then, my students say the sounds and they separate them out. They're segmenting these sounds. Notice why I have space between each one, because then the next thing I'm going to do is go back to what I read and take a look at how is each of those phonemes represented in print. The S, the S was represented by an S, the I by an I, the T by a T. And then I'm going to go through the same process regardless of how complex this word is. So let's say it's cough. I have a K, aw. Now I can know the K is easy and the F, well, I know that's O-U-G-H. Aw, maybe the aw is easy with the O and then the U-G-H being the F. That's a tricky one, but I'm still connecting what are the sounds, how were they represented in print. So this is easier with the sight and sight. What are the sounds? Were the same, it's sight in both. How are they represented in print? In this case, the S and the T were the same as the first, but the I here is an I consonant E, and then the I here is the IGH. This is a process that's behind the scenes cognitive task in which we store words in our long-term memory. It's not a skill or a curriculum, it's a process. Okay, thank you, Deborah. Okay, so how do these affect each other? This, remember how I said each one of these affected this way? And I think it's common, it makes sense that they would affect each other this way. So that my ability, remember early phonological awareness, this was my alliteration and rhyming. My basic was blending and segmenting. And my proficiency would be able to manipulate, add and delete phonemes. So by learning my individual rhyming, that supports my letter name knowledge. So I'm able to notice how these have patterns, starting to look at the statistical regularity of our language. My basic phonemic awareness, that's where I'm blending and segmenting, supports my ability to sound out individual words and blend them together. I mean, sound out the individual sounds and words and blend them together to make whole words. But then it's my advanced phonemic awareness, my manipulation, where I'm paying attention to those individual sounds that supports my memory for this. How can I really help my students do this? Is through spelling. Help them notice how those words are spelled and paying attention to the connections and sound symbol connections. It gets complicated though once they start their learning, because I'm going to add on a couple more arrows. Once I start learning my letters and letter names and letter sounds, that helps me blend and segment them, because I recognize that those letters represent sounds that I can pull apart and put back together. Those skills help me sound out words, which helps me pay attention to the individual parts of words and notice that when I change the ul to an r in the word clash, it becomes crash. Or I take out the ul and slip and it becomes sip. Those I'm noticing, and I'm able to work with these more, which of course supports my orthographic mapping, which is remembering them. Why is this important? Well, number one, we know, as many of you have listened to Sold a Story, you've seen this in your own kids, you recognize that if I read to kids and they see this, it's not going to lead to their own individual automatic word recognition, is it? So next we thought, okay, if I my kids sound the words out, that will lead to automatic recognition. Some kids, yes, but really, it looks like that's all that's happening. In reality, what they're doing is they're going through the orthographic mapping phase. And for some of our kids, it looks like it's going completely that blue arrow, but it's not. Their brains are going through this orthographic mapping process. For some of our kids who struggle to do this on their own, they're going to need some explicit support and help with paying attention to the sound symbol correspondences. So I've talked quite a bit about this. I want to give you a break to talk to each other. I'm going to pause and reflect, give you a moment to talk about orthographic mapping and share your thoughts in a breakout room. and to choose then a representative to share when we come back. I'm going to pause the,
I don't mind.
thank you. Hi, Catherine.
Oh my gosh, we talked about so much.
Good.
But some of the things we talked about specifically were like, I mean, I shared that it's very individualized for my students, kind of what they need to get that map done. But we talked about how a lot of visuals are so helpful. Like a few of us shared that like we use the itchy for the sound, and then I have a student where, anytime they're struggling with that, if I just go like this, they're like, itchy. And that when I'm teaching just like very initial letter sound correspondence, and I'm not the only one, we talked about how having visuals of the actual mouth formation next to the letter, so that they're always practicing that, like, not only is that an A and there's an apple, but the mouth is going, it's open and the tongue isn't touching any teeth or area, and that's part of the learning and that's part of the mapping. So we talked a lot about some different curriculums and style, like Orton Gillingham and Wired for Reading, but that those visuals or like some sort of body movements or something that can really like help commit things to memory, or helped like remind when just looking at a letter isn't enough to get them to be like making those connections, right?
It's funny you mentioned the movement. I met with a former pediatrician yesterday who has developed what she calls my active alphabet. And she sent it to me via PDF. I haven't had a chance to download it yet. But you notice that this kid's body is in the shape of a J for jump. And when she has an L for lazy, the kid's lying down like a capital L. Or an I for a little I for ice cream, or an icy. Frankly, I wish she used short I's. I don't know if I haven't had a chance to look through the whole thing, but it's very interesting that she's got body movement for each of them. So Catherine, yes, and yes, I'm so glad you had a great conversation. Thank you. Is there somebody from another room who'd like to share?
Our group was mostly talking about dyslexia and how to diagnose it, or where to diagnose it, and what about in the schools if we're not going to diagnose it, does it matter? Or and I kind of said I think that on OSPI there's some screening tools that you can kind of use, because otherwise they're pretty much just lumped into specific to learning disordered kids. So which I don't know if that's good or bad, but
well, it is a specific learning disorder. So that is where they get lumped. But Jill, I will say that I have many districts who say to me, we don't diagnose dyslexia. And my answer is, so that doesn't mean you're not going to do anything about it. And doesn't mean you don't evaluate and identify that a kid has dyslexia. You can see it in your assessments that you do for a regular SLD. You've got a kid whose reading comprehension is up high and individual word reading is low. There's your kid with dyslexia. It's really the word reading piece, not the language comprehension.
And also I was going to say, I don't know if you've seen these.
That looks familiar. Is that Florida Center for Reading Research?
They're just a group of cards I ordered, and it has the thing on the front, and then on the back it has like these movable little things that tell you how to make the sound. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but
a little bit. You can see where it's those old picture things.
Yeah, that move to tell how to make the sound. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful.
Very cool. If you could put a link to that, that would be really cool to see. What I was holding up earlier was tools for reading, and they have, Lori's nodding, they have mouth cards. Notice this chart. It looks like what we did last week when we talked about how they're made. Notice we've got the B and the and the B and and we have the D and the So it's just mirrors the chart that we did last time, as well as the vowel valley. And then they have their phonemes and graphemes and how they're represented as well. All right. Yes, lots and lots of good stuff. So let's get into it, because this is really the crucial piece. Is, in fact, I've discovered that the most important thing we teach is the reality that speech is represented in print imperfectly and yet predictably. I'll go back to this one, that the letters and letter patterns represent sounds of spoken language in an imperfect, yet, and, but, however, there is a predictability here. And that's where really what it comes down to, is recognizing the statistical regularity of our language. This is crucial for the development of phonic decoding skills, and we usually develop it in this predictable sequence. Now, I say usually because there are programs who want to skip letter names and go to letter shapes. There are advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of starting with letter names is kids will sing the ABCs. They know, that this is something that might happen before they come to school. And it may not. Lori's got something to celebrate, so she'll come back. And then they start writing them, and they start recognizing those shapes in their environment. And then we start attaching the sounds to them. So that's the typical development of these skills. The other thing about letter names is that is the one stable. I'm not sure if I talk about this later or not, because I'm looking at what. Yes, we do talk about it later. So we'll come back to that. So let's talk though about understanding speech to understanding print. That's why we did the phonology first, is because one of the things Louisa Moat stresses all the time is that we have to understand the sounds in our mouth, that when we speak, that when I say a word, it's actually made up of several different movements that my mouth is doing, so then I can represent it in print and notice those representations. One of the things I want to pause here though is notice that speech and print are both, one's temporary, one's permanent, but they both have some ambiguities. Notice the differences though. Let's go to the print side for a moment. Notice each of those could be read in two different ways or more. Wind, wind, dove, dove, read, read, sewer, sower, live, live. You can come up with other examples like those. Though there are not that many of them, there are a lot more of the homophones where it's the same sound but different spelling. The question is why? Why are there so many more, and which one is easier for us in our brains? I'm gonna put that out there. If there's anybody who wants to take over talking for me, I mean, what do you think? Why do we have so many more of, I'm getting my little spotlight here. Why are there so many more of these than there are of these? It does make things harder for reading. It truly does. Initially, as we're learning to read, but the reality is, once I'm a strong reader, this actually, having 3 different spellings, it makes it easier for me as a reader. Why? Because I don't have to look at context to figure this out. This one I do, don't I? Is it wind or wind? Depends on the context. Dove or dove. I mean, all these depend on the context. So I have to look at the words around those words to determine which one it is. Not if they're spelled differently. If they're spelled differently, all I have to do is look at the spelling, and that cues to me immediately the meaning. I don't have to look at the words around. And so it makes it harder for spelling, but a lot easier for reading because we immediately recognize the difference. I mean, if I say the word no to you and I want you to spell it, you're going to ask me, which one do you mean? This one or this one? Well, that's where understanding meaning is so crucial, because if we spell these the same way, then we would lose on the connection to knowledge in the second one. And so understanding meaning is really crucial with spelling, not so hard with reading. Somebody's added in context. See, Deborah, you're on the same page. Exactly.
I get it, because I was thinking about, spelling. Didn't realize it, but going, yeah, thank you.
Yep, those homophones are harder to spell, easier to read. So that's the key piece, because when we see a word written down, we're seeing more than those sounds, aren't we? We're seeing the spelling conventions, we're seeing the historical influences, we're seeing the meaningful parts of that, and I'll explain, I'll have some examples in a moment. But we're seeing the grammatical class of the words sometimes, depending on how it's used. Many of our words can be used in many ways. We'll talk about that when we talk about syntax. but we also are seeing too the meaning, which is the morphology piece as well. So in our examples of complex conflicts, I've already talked about the no and no, but let's look at the number 2. If I spelled it, all of the words to like this, that was fine when we listened to all of our words. But once we started listening with our eyes, we needed to differentiate these, didn't we? Okay, here's another truism. We write with as many letters, as few letters as we can, as many as we have to. So TO can make 2, got it. That's the one I kind of swallow. I'm going to the store. But I want to put some stronger meaning. I want to go 2. So I'm going to add on another letter. That's how I'm going to differentiate between 2 and 2. I'm going to add on another letter to the one that has stronger meaning. Now I've got another one that is, it used to be pronounced twa in some languages. Well, that could be if you anybody's watched Outlander and heard the Gaelic, they say twa. Well, I can say 2 if I think of 12, 20, tween. This TW, it actually is an old English meaning the 2 things. So I can connect this to 12 and 20 and those other twist, twine, twilight, that prefix twi having to do with 2 things. Twin is another one. Notice these all have to do with the meaning of 2. So that's that connection. I have to find some way to differentiate between those. I'm going to put that W in there. We have to be careful when we are teaching kids to memorize things visually. My daughter says, okay, 2. And then no. She knew there had to be a W in there somewhere, right? So that's toe, like in window. Remember, O says O like in snow, or it could say ow like in cow. So it could be tow, which it's not, but that is a real word, like to tow something behind you. So no, you're right, there needs to be a W. But if you stick it in there between the T and the O, then you won't have to worry about the pronunciation of it. It won't change the words. And then of course, with the word jumped, if we spelled it the way it sounds, we would completely lose the fact that it's past tense, because jumped, I have that at the end. If we spelled things the way they sound, we would have a hard time reading and writing, honestly. Okay, so let's talk regularity. My question for you. What percentage, please put in the chat box, of everyday English words do you think are irregularly spelled? This is always fun to do. Let's see what numbers come in. We're seeing 25, 50, 20, 15. I like seeing the lower numbers. Too many. Oh, Mackenzie, stick around me for a while. Their number will get smaller and smaller. Cindy's got the price, probably, I think, the closest one with 5. Let's put them up. So according to Louisa Moats, about half of our words are just a 50% one-to-one correspondence, where like at 34% you could spell correctly with just one error, like the S in island. There's a historical weird reason for that, but there is a reason. In fact, I'll take you right now to my favorite ability to check those and the explanations for all those. Oh, this one, that one, I'm just gonna leave that because that one's a fun one to come back to. Hopefully it's not gonna start. It does. Stop. There we go. I'll leave that one up. But my favorite one for spelling is if you go to Erica Okrent, A-R-I-K-A, Erica A-I-R, Erica Okrent.
The thing that's different about a verbal
Not me.
dictation home,
It is, sorry.
you always have the whole.
Let's stop. Erica Okrent and her spelling videos are so much fun, and they really explain videos. They explain spelling and why there are why things are spelled the way they do. So I highly encourage you to, like, for example, the S in island, she explains why that's there. Lots and lots of fun. Even my daughter loves them. Just learning a little bit about language. Okay, so that's that one error. If we add on some additional knowledge, like those suffixes, like that ed saying t, and so that other additional information, we can add on another 12% with really only 4 that are truly, truly odd. So I've got a fun little video here that I found once on unfortunately it was on Facebook, so I couldn't grab a link to it, but I took this screenshot This woman was pretending to be English and Spanish and saying, what's going on with all your spelling there, English? And she's like, well, we spell French words like French and German words like German and Dutch words like Dutch. And that's why our spelling is really crazy. And the Spanish said, well, what about that S in island? Oh, she says it's the throw pillow spelling. No, it's never going to be. In fact, it's actually a very strange reason. It was misanalyzed as being from connected to the Latin Island, and it's not. It's never had an S. It shouldn't have an S, but it does. So let's get into the research just a little bit on what we need to know. And this is really, we know this. We've seen Mark Seidenberg and everyone talking about you really need to assimilate that knowledge of how print and sound are related. We need to be doing these things fluently, rapidly, automatically. And that letter sound knowledge is central to both phonic decoding and sight word learning. As we've talked about, it's both letters and sounds. So how do we do this? Well, number one, we need to recognize that meaning is the hook. So if I asked you to memorize one of these lists, which one do you think that you could memorize most easily and report back? Put a number in the chat box. Everyone's going to be saying one, aren't you? Is anybody not saying one? Should I just ask that instead? Raise your hand if you think that any of the lists other than one would be the easiest one for you to memorize. No, because you have meaning for all of these. You might not remember exactly what they stand for. Like SPCA is a tricky one, but it's where if you're going to go adopt a cat, it has to do with like the pound or something like that. It's animals, Society for the Protection Against the Cruelty of Animals, something like that. But you have meaning for it. You can remember, and if you said SPCA, oh, that one's going to stick in your head. Versus if I say BASM, no meaning to it. So this is meaning is the hook, and that's what helps us connect these sound symbol correspondences and remember those. Because remember that reading requires visual input, but we store it phonologically. It's that phonological memory for how we remember words. Because remember, we had this triangle in the past with from Mark Seidenberg, connecting the sound, the meaning, and the orthography, the written forms. This is when we're creating our written vocabulary. And the stronger we have these connections, the stronger memory we will have for words. Okay, so let's jump into those connections. Because, yeah, we only have 2 hours, right? So remember I said those 50% one-to-one connections. That would be things like mat and dog, where the is really only going to be spelled with an M, and especially in the beginning of a word. It could be an NM, but that's really rare. That's Greek. But this is just the most common predictable connections here. And that's what you see in the at and dog. The 1 to 2, that is where we have a lot of tricky parts, like we had earlier with sight and fight and sight and bear and pair. These are our homonyms, where there's more than one way of spelling a sound, or maybe the symbols you see represent more than one sound, like the O in hopping and hoping, or the long A in those 3 different ways in rain, play, and made. And then you have your really rare patterns, the UGH, like in laugh, enough, cough, or the UGH in dough and through and bow. The UGH is just a tricky one. And so it's one we teach our kids. This isn't going to happen all that often, and it's going to be weird. And there are a few options we can give for you. I do want to give you a reference to a handout where you can see what I call keywords for yellow cards. And I think my yellow cards are actually in the car from my teaching this morning, but I can get them when you're in the next breakout. But I will take you to that keywords for yellow cards and show you what I mean by it as soon as it comes up. Okay, so here it is, keywords for yellow cards. And these originally started from Slingerland, Chartwell. I've added to them, and I think I could even add more now. This is going from the sound to the symbol. And this is not everything, but you can see these are the most common. I'll make it a little bit bigger for you to see more easily. Notice we have the long vowel sounds, starting with the open syllable, a constant E. So these are the most common spellings for the different sounds. Notice that, for example, let's go to the consonants. Notice for the Z that the S precedes the Z. Because while the Z consistently that presents z, the S does more frequently, boys and nose and rose, that especially at the end of a word, when it's not a plural, and even when it is a plural, it will make the z sound. So that S at the end, the z sound at the end is more often represented by an S than it does a z. What else has come into the chat? Yes, I'll get the attendance link for those who've come in late. Oh, I have to go grab it again. I hate that when you, with chat box, we can't come back to that. So I'll grab that for you in a moment. All right, first though, we're going to jump into those one-to-one correspondences because I have an activity for us here. So I can freeze it and then go to the activity. My question for you, how many letters can you think of that only represent one sound? So that's going to be the first column. And then the second column is how many sounds can you think of that are only represented by one letter or one group of letters? So I'll give you a moment with that. I'll pause our sharing here and I will go and grab the attendance link for us while you're looking and try thinking about how many of those can you think of. Anyone? Let's see, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box yet. All right, things are starting to come in. Oh, okay, we've got Nina, I'd be curious which ones you came up with. So I will say, Rachel, that my list got smaller and smaller every time I would do this. Because I would think, well, what about when it's followed by a this? Or what about when it's followed by a that? So here's my current list. And I know others will say, no, T is always going to represent. I said, well, but not if it's followed by an H. Then it becomes or the. And now if it's preceded by a C or sorry, if it's TCH, then it becomes ch. So I have my what ifs and what ifs that keep pushing me to think more about the fact that our language is extremely flexible. Our letters, more of them are what I call flex letters and what I call brick letters. That we have to think about to teach kids to flex the sounds. And S is a great example for them to get started. It could make S, or it could make Z, like an is and has and was. So rather than teaching them that that's a crazy word you need to memorize, teach them that S represents different sounds. And at the end, in this way, in this case, it's going to often make Z instead of S. Oh, Lori, we're talking about English only. You're right. Tammy, you said 6. Let's see, which 6 or 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, you know what? I'm realizing this is an old list. Oh, yep, that double T. So my newer list, let me I took off the P because if it's followed by an H, it becomes, let's see what else I took off. Someone had a list shorter than mine. So someone said double R. Tell me more about that. Why that double R? I'm not thinking Spanish words. English words though, Lori. What would the double R sound like? So I'm talking about silent. There are a lot of these could be silent, but could it ever represent something other than the? I have not been able to find one. So B is definitely on my list. The reason why I have F with an asterisk is because of the word of, it's the unstressed version of off. So it used to be spelled the same way. And as we stressed one more, it got the other F. In fact, very often, if you think of wolf, wolves, roofs, that F to V is just it's an easier pronunciation where at the end it gets stronger. And in the middle, it becomes a V sound. I think that is my current list, if I remember correctly. Like I said, it keeps getting smaller and smaller for me. A couple other people had smaller. Tammy, you had a smaller list. I'd be curious what you would cross off on mine. But if you think of it, let me know.
Well, actually, I was gonna ask you, now, are you saying, so those letters can only make the one sound, or there's only one sound that we can associate with them? How am I saying this?
Yes.
So like, yeah, well, because I'm thinking like the sound J, which it sounds like J, could be a G too. So like when
So
you
that's
say,
why.
that's
the
why I'm
next
kind of working
category.
both directions, and like can be the ER or 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 UR teams too. So that's where I'm kind of confused as to which
So we're
direction
going here
talking.
from print to speech, not speech to print. So just which letters, when you see it, it will only represent one sound. This next category here, that's what you're talking about. How many sounds can you only represent in one way? Somebody asked, Leisha, what about when the K is silent? K can be silent, and most of these could be silent. M can be silent, L can be silent, think of walk and talk. The W can be silent in wrist and wrench. So a lot of these could be silent, but the question is, could they represent a different sound? So that's why I say 1 to 1. Here's my list of what you're talking about, Tammy. A lot fewer. We have B and ol and P and V are usually represented by B, L, P, and V. My asterisk again because of the word of. The A is usually by an O, except for we've got sometimes it's by an A, like in what. The th and the are both usually represented by TH. All the rest of them, when you said multiple ways of spelling that. Sh, multiple ways of spelling that. Most every other sound, multiple ways of spelling them. So very few of them have that 1-to-1 correspondence. All right, everybody's feeling comfortable with that? Hence the complication of our language, right? Our language is very, very complex. So how do we teach these green words? Number 1, writing. Writing. I cannot stress it enough. We are most effective teaching reading through writing. Notice why. Those movements involved in writing leave a motor memory in the sensor-motor part of the brain, which helps us to recognize those letters. Because as you are writing, you're also seeing it and you're feeling it. So it's not just the motor, but it's also the visual happening at the same time. Oftentimes, too, we use keywords to unlock the sound. However, we need to be careful on some of those keywords. And in fact, I'm going to pull up a non-example. Consistency is key. You can see, whoops, some keywords behind me. They're all over the room. But those are the Slingerland cards. They've actually luckily changed cake. It's now cup, which I agree with. You could do cup or cat, because the word cake has the letter K sound in the beginning of it. K and K. So that's not a good one anymore. So I'm going to put out on an exercise for us. I'm going to put it in the chat, but I'll also put it up here for us to example and try. I'll leave that up just in case I need it. And I'll put that into the chat. There's our list here. Now let's take a look at these keywords and have a chat about which ones you would not suggest and why. So there are some that are not the greatest, but there are 5 that they have identified as really not such good ones. So take a moment and look at them into the chat and see what you think. Which ones would you not agree with? For helping the kids learn the sounds. Everyone's saying giraffe. Yep, definitely giraffe. Because G does say giraffe, but that's a French word. Jennifer, ice cream. Yes, let's start with the most common. Remember that the I, like itch, I saw someone saying, or inch. Lori, definitely. Yes, X does represent the Z in xylophone, but not very commonly. And that's a Greek word. That's more an advanced word for our kids. All right, so we've gotten giraffe, ice cream, xylophone. What else? We have 2 more. The vase, Jennifer, I'm not sure. I'd love to hear why you think that. Tammy, definitely on snake. But Tammy, will you want to unmute and explain why?
Oh, it's the blend. You're hearing more of the than this.
It's harder to pull it off, isn't it? If I use sun or try to think of something that doesn't, just a s before a vowel is easier to pull off than the s before. Colleen's got the last one that, well, really? Thank you, no problem. Someone who needs to leave. So let's look at those answers. And yes, those are the ones that were identified. Some people say teddy bear. I agree. It's not the best, but is it whale or is it whale? That's a really good question. Let's not complicate things for kids. So yes, keywords can unlock the sounds, but they also can be something that, you know, are complicated for our kids. So I started to talk about what about the letter names. You'll notice some research here. The letter naming accuracy does predict reading achievement, and it is a springboard for learning and remembering letter sound relationships. And this is the one I'd like to talk about a lot, is the third one here, that they are the only stable property of letters. The sounds may vary, the shapes may vary. And one of the most important thing when I say teaching reading through writing is to have our kids write it themselves, and they'll notice that notice how imperfect that is. Or when you see it in print with this little funky hat, it all is an A. This is an A. It's not perfect, but as the kids write it and recognize it, A, they're all, it's the sound sum of correspondence that's going to connect it for them, not the exact form. So hence lots of different forms can be close enough. They have to get they're set for variability where we approximate it and we get there. But some letter names, there are little relationships to the sounds they represent. So yes, we need to know the letter names and sounds, but we have to be careful and recognize when this is going to be a challenge. So for example, I'm just going to put these up in interest of time, and then you can chat about them later with your colleagues. Question, well, it's kind of fun. I'll let you try some of them first before I bring them up. Can you think of a letter where you said the name? I already gave one away. The letter K. K. Notice how I hear it in the beginning of K. So that would be up here. But C, I'm not going to put that in here because it's a secondary sound, but it is not the most common sound. Let's think about, what about L, L, F, F, O? That is a second sound in the letter's name. And some that it's not in the name at all. This is again just consonant sounds. So let's see what people are bringing in. B, you have it in the beginning. B, H, that would definitely be one down here, wouldn't it be, Tammy? H, because that's when you've got the poor kid who writes chicken. Okay, he's got chicken because it says H. Q falls down there as well. Then you have a K in Q. That's a tricky one. I may change my mind sometimes when I write these. All right, let's see what I had in the past. Your B, J, and J, K, P, Q. You have a K in Q. Because antique and unique. What you're thinking of, Jill, whoever wrote that, I think it was you, Jill, right? I see you squinching. Is when we do the Q, U, it is the U that makes the W sound. The Q makes K, and this makes W, like in queen. I have two sounds, queen. We teach them together because they are most usually together. Well, they're always together, and they're usually making Q, like in queen. Now, unless it's followed by an E at the end of a word, like antique or unique. But it's always got that K sound in the middle. That's why I have that in that list. Thank you, Cindy, for others that need to leave. Okay, so what about the ones where it's second? F, L, M, N, R, S, and X. And I think our last ones, we had Jill put the H and the W. Oh, those poor kids with W. They hear the D at the beginning of W, right? And sometimes they'll spell it with that. And the Y, they'll spell with a W instead. Those are tricky. G, J. I didn't put G or C because you have an alternate sound. So G does say J, but it is not the most common sound of G. And C does represent, but again, not commonly. These would be more their French versions. Hence, G and G says J in French words and C says S in French words. But our Germanic, we have G and we have, so they're tricky ones that I wouldn't put on those lists. And we'd recognize the trickiness with our kids, that would definitely be a yellow one, not a green. Okay. And when I said the order of syllables, this is just thinking about, as we're teaching these, let's think about the complexity of how we can build. If we had more time, I would have you build some of your own. I'm building up, going from one vowel sound to a consonant and a vowel sound to a vowel consonant sound. Notice then we're building up our blends. And we have a CVC, a blend before, 2 blends, and a single sound afterwards, 2 blends after, blend. So you notice how we are building the complexity. So when I'm working with my students and we're just doing, for example, and let's get rid of these longer ones, the me and the ice and ski. But if I'm working on just closed syllables, look how, well, I've got a long one here. Look how I can keep building on the complexity on how many sounds. So this is to keep in mind, start with the easier, the less complex, and build to the more complex. Okay, the order for blending. This is one of the things that earlier we talked about, which are more difficult for writing. I already had some of these up, I'll put it all up. When we have our continuant sounds, it's easier for our kids to blend. Remember last time we talked about those ones you can stretch and pull? So your nasals, we have our fricatives and we have our glides. These are easier for our kids to blend into our vowels because you can hold them. Man versus p, a, t. Notice how those are harder for blending, and our combiners are those ones are hard as well. Okay, I do have a breather here built in. I want to give you like a 2-minute stretch, stand and stretch. I will pause the recording. When we come back, we're going to get into the yellow words. Not long though, because we have to get yellow and red, and we want to make sure we get everything in there today. So welcome back. Let's get into those yellow flag words. This is when there's more than one way. What yellow means we need to slow down and think. So these are very often our Old English, Anglo-Saxon words. When my son said, Mom, that K-N-I-G-H-T-Y, I said, honey, it's a really, really old word. We used to pronounce it knecht. We don't have a in our language anymore. Well, we kept the spelling. We've changed how we pronounce things after we decided how to spell them. Notice how we've got these clues here between heel and health, or heel and feet. Look for the connections and meaning as much as possible to help your students recognize those differences. And sometimes it's going to take some memorization. Like between C, well, the 2 E's are the same, like my 2 I's are the same, but S-E-A, I'm going to go to, that's the other one. So helping recognize how words are sounded and the word origin. But one of the things when I say that the sound placement, here's a great example. You may have heard George Bernard Shaw say English is crazy. You can spell fish, G-H-O-T-I. Remember, notice how he's got the F from enough, and the I from women, and the T-I from nation, and he gets G-H-O-T-I for fish. He's wrong, because at the end of a word, at the beginning of a word, G-H says G, doesn't it? Like in ghost and ghoul. And an O will never say it in the middle of a single syllable word. And a TI has to be followed by an AN or an ON. So hence, no, because of placements, we can never spell fish, G-H-O-T-I. What does we do? I'm going to actually bring all these up. We can talk about them. Whoops, went too far. Okay. That the language of origin, look at those examples. Charade. It comes from French. Spaghetti from Italian. Mosquito from Spanish. We talked about the position of rough and motion in women, but look about the meaning and morphological structure. If we spell played the way it sounds, we completely lose its connection to the ED, that past tense. And then the sounds before or after, if we have a S before, we don't spell it SF, we just don't, because that's an old English word. that SF combination came into our language through Greek. So that's our historical basis as well. So I feel like we've been doing enough whole group for a while. I need to put you in breakout groups for this conversation. So I'm going to actually share screen while you're talking and let you have a conversation about some of these orthographic conventions. What do you know about these? What do you know about why you would use a WR instead of an R? When do you use WR? When do you use TCH, DGECK? How's your comfort? And we've talked about soft C and soft G a little bit. I've kind of given you a little bit of a preview about that. Talk about that interesting E. Why is there an E in those words? Curse and moose and mouse and have. Think about examples of when we don't use, and why don't we end words in a V or a J or an I or a U? And the V, there's an example or two with never say never. I need to adjust that. Talk about those silent letters. What are related words where you can hear those letters? And are you familiar with the floss roll, the buzz off miss pill? So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. I will do this sharing while you're there. And hopefully we haven't lost too many people to make your rooms really different. There we go. So let's hear some of your conversations. Hopefully those rooms were big enough for you to have a conversation about these. And let's talk about what you shared. Let's start with the first bullet. Did anyone talk about when you use WR? When you use, whoops, I can't draw a straight line very well. Let me clear that off and try again. There is a little line feature. When do you use WR? Do these come, this one actually, there is something to think about here and talk about. These three can come either the beginning, the middle, or the end. These three have something in common. Did anyone talk about any of those you would like to share out? Or you can talk about all of them, whatever you discussed in your group. But we do have some things we want to touch on with those.
We
I heard a
talked
voice.
about,
Hi, Tammy.
hi, we talked about the CK and the TCH and the DGE, and the fact that it's the 111, so one syllable, one short vowel, and the k ch or j comes immediately after the short vowel. We use the CK, TCH, or DGE.
At the end of a word, right after a short vowel. Exactly. Although the CK one also can be in the middle of like chicken, so it's at the end of that first syllable.
First syllable, well, it says at the end of a syllable, not the end of a word. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Tammy. Did someone else talk about any of these other digraphs and trigraphs? Does anyone know when we use the WR instead of an R? Think about words that have WR. Well, first of all, it always comes at the beginning. You'll never find it anywhere else. What was that?
Oh, sorry, right, like WRITE.
Wrist, right, wrench, wrap, like to wrap presents, wrestle. What do all those have in common? What does your wrist do? What does it do while you're writing? What does it do when you're wrapping something or ring something? What do those all have to do with? It twists, doesn't it? When you ring something, you're twisting it. When you wrestle, you're twisting your body around another. When you're wrong, you have a twisted idea. Even a wren flies in a twisted motion. So they all have to do with twisting in some way. So that's a cue for you on the WR versus R. It's a very, very old word, and they have to do with twisting. The WH we all know only comes at the beginning, right? And that's our question words. And then there are some other weird ones like whale that I don't have an explanation for. I'd have to look them up. I'd go to Adam Online to look up those to find out more. Did anybody think about some examples on soft C and soft G? Did anyone have a conversation about those? And did anybody talk about these words? Why we don't pronounce those jet and jurl? There's a reason. Any group touch on those? Anyone know? Anyone here speak German? I'm saying, so Jill, in German language, how do you pronounce this name? How do you pronounce that in German?
Angela. And same thing with gym would be gymnasium with a G.
These are old Germanic words. Remember, I said earlier that giraffe and gentle and all of those EI or Y dance, those are all French words. Or the gym, which is Greek, it's come into us through French. Our Frenchified pronunciation. I love how you gave the example, Jill. It would be, did you say gym or gym?
Gymnasium.
A gymnasium. I'd never heard that, so thank you. I learned something today. I learn something every day, but thank you, Jill, for that. I didn't know that that was pronounced gymnasium. What a great example that when we have the Germanic, it's a G, and the French, it's a J. So the language origin. And so you teach kids, yes, it's usually a J, unless it's an old word like get and girl, and those ones you shouldn't have too many problems with. You just have to get to know that one. Okay. How about that crazy E here in moose and mouse and curse? We kind of gave already when we said we don't end words in a V. But what about those other three? And the reason, and we can talk about why we don't do these two as well, particularly this one, why we don't end in a V, a J, an I, or U. We put an E after them always. Think of blue, and instead of a J at the end, we're going to write DGE or GE.
I'm wondering, I'm not good at this, obviously. I don't know enough yet. But like, I was wondering about the word mini.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's short. So is it because it's just slang in a sense? Well-established slang, but.
Yeah, established word. I mean, like taxi is another one. Taxi, mini, they're very modern words. And just like when we say we don't end in a V, people say, what about rev? Well, it's short for revolution. Like when you rev your
like with the word you, Y-O-U. But is it because it's with the O? So it does.
It's an OU combination, exactly. Just
Yeah.
So it's not a single I or a single U at the end. And again, these have to do with when our language was first written, Deborah. It was handwritten. And it was really hard to tell the difference between a V and a U at the end.
Right.
So they would add an E to it.
Like seaman in Lewis and Clark was mistranslated because of the way it was written.
Handwritten language was,
Yes.
yes, that was the cause here. Now, that's not the cause for these three, curse, moose, and mouse. Anybody have a conversation about why that E is there in those three?
Tammy knows. She was giving us a whole education on all of this. She was fantastic.
So what did you learn, Jill?
That like if you didn't have the E on moose, it would be moose. It would be confused with the, like, they didn't know if it was the plural moose.
What a cow does, right?
Right.
Or more than one moo. More than one cur, because we use S's to make things plural or third person singular. And so if you would be more than one mow, more than one cur, more than one moo, or what a cow does. And if you teach middle school, don't use the word horse as an example. I don't need to say more. With your silent letters here, and I'll go a little more quickly because we have a few things to do. If we think of autumnal, signal, or signature, you sign your signature. I give you an assignment. I turn in my resignation. Notice how that G is sometimes pronounced, sometimes not, in all of those related words. Resign, resignation, assign, assignment, assignation. Bomb, bombard, or bombastic. Hymn, hymnal. Autumn, autumnal. So you can see those related words. And it is usually the one that is furthest from, except in the word sign, I'd have to look up the etymology on that one, but it's usually the one that's furthest from the vowel sound that is silent. And does everybody feel comfortable with this floss rule that if you have a single syllable word that ends in FLS or Z, you're usually going to double that FLS or Z. Sometimes people ask, well, what about gas? Well, it's short for gasoline. And elf, well, yep, agreed. Whoops, elf, well, that's not just that after an S, so that's not a good example. Pal is a relatively recent word. there aren't that many where it is an exception. Again, we write with a few letters as we can, as many as we have to. And do we have to do this for pronunciation? No, but off we need to, because otherwise it'd be of, miss, it would be Ms. And the others, it adds sure on my visual. And the floss rule is kind of just in our old words, not as easy to explain to kids. In sign is because the G is the final sound with, oh, thank you, Tammy. I love that. The G is the final sound within the first syllable. Sign. You mean like in signature and signal?
Yeah, it's the, like in those words, the first syllable ends in that G. And so that's why it's not the last letter, but it's last heard sound.
It's a related words. And we have to be careful in how we teach some of those words. I think of, for example, you know, the ing when we teach it as a suffix, but then you have ring and thing, it's no longer a suffix. And so we do have some complicated things we need to teach our kids. And who is it? Deborah, I think you said, you're still learning this. There is so much to learn here. There's so much to learn. And this is where we go slowly with our kids and we help them learn it. And when they say, well, why? Well, like when my son said, Mom, that IGH and night, why? I'm like, well, let's go to Edem Online. I go to Edem Online all the time. My favorite site. And I'll put it in the chat box for you. And let's look it up why. Or when he said that EAU and beauty, Mom, why? Because that's a hard one to spell, isn't it? I said, well, I bet you anything that's French. EAUTY. We've got lots of vowels that I don't pronounce, lots of consonants I don't pronounce. That's going to be Old French. Beauté. So I go to Edem Online, and when I looked to the history of the word, the origin, that when I said, like, for example, girl and get, those Germanic, let's put get, and we see it comes from, here we go, Old Norse, geta, Old Swedish, we see Old English is what, Old Dutch, so this is a really, really old word. And so I tell them that this was before the French invaded. The French invaded in 1100. This was probably already part of our language before the French came in. That's when the GE and the GI and all that. So let's get into understanding. And I want my kids to be questioning, reading researchers, and trying, instead of just accepting this is how it's spelled, why hopping has 2 P's and hoping has 1, which we'll talk about next week when we talk about syllabification. Understand the patterns. It's all about patterns. This is one thing that you can do to help as a strategy for, again, keywords. Give them something to think about. Do it. CH chair, WH wheel, TH thimbles, or TH this. So giving them those keywords to help them. We can use sorts to support them. So here's another strategy is, I think it was Tammy or Jill, someone who talked about the TCH and the TCH and DGE and CK coming at the end of a word right after a short vowel. If we had more time and we did this in person, I could have you sort these into the different either ch sounds or j, and then notice you've sorted again. The ones on the left have TCH and the ones on the right have just CH. And again, DGE or GE. And then have your kids look at them and see why. Notice here that TCH is always right after a short vowel. Whereas here, I have a consonant before the ch. I have an ow, a long vowel before ch. A consonant before ch. The same thing here. Here's a long vowel. Here's a consonant. Long vowel, consonant. You get the idea. So to help your kids solidify those patterns. Because it's all about statistics. I do have one thing that I put into the Jamboard for us to do. Well, I'd rather us do it together. But I'm going to do talk about the red flag words first, those really rare patterns. I once had a student or an SLP said, one of her students came to her one day and she said, okay, I know that this makes eh, and this is I, and this is g, and this is h, and this is t. So what's this eh, g, t? So that's where we usually will teach it to them as one unit. Or we can help them break it down, help support their orthographic mapping, and help them recognize that this is the 2 sounds, A and T. In this case, A is a very old word. It's like night and fight and all those. That normally when we see that IGH, that's I, right? But if it's EIGH, that's A, like in sleigh and way and 8. There aren't a lot of those. That's why we're going to call it really rare. That's how it's read. But it does occur. And we're going to teach them in patterns. Look at these relationships. People often say said is a crazy word because the AI makes the S sound. Well, teach it in relationships. Notice how it's the past tense of say. Maybe in the past we used to pronounce it said, like paid and laid. And oh, he said that to me. It's too awkward for our mouth, isn't it? It's easier to say said. So our mouths change the pronunciation. It's easier. There might be some dialects where they actually pronounce it said, like paid. Let's show those relationships. And then your kids could say, well, what about stayed? Notice I've got the ED. Like, yeah, that probably came into our language later because ED is a more common way of making an ending now. And I'm not always going to change that Y to an I. This is again where when they say that there is an irregular one, I'm like, is it really? Let's look at THEY and THEIR. Remember that, change the Y to I. We'll talk about those in a couple, not next week, but the week after. So let's look at those patterns as much as possible. You've got that Y to I right there. That Y and I are very, very, very interchangeable. When I say very interchangeable, not just for vowel sounds, but consonant as well. Okay, am I blowing your minds yet? Let's think about this word like million, billion. You hear that I making a Y sound, onion. That I and Y are very interchangeable. Okay, we've got those. Let's look at, here's another one. Go, goes, going, no problem, right? And yet we have a problem with does, done, and doing, particularly does. Let's show them the pattern. Show them that goes, which sounds easy for them to write, follows the same pattern as does. Does, and again, what I'm seeing, this is that imperfect relationship between speech and print. We're trying to represent meaning more than anything. Meaning is most paramount when we say looking at the relationship between speech and print. Meaning comes first. It will override sounds. Here are some other connections. You know, that nasty L. Well, in would and should, that L is connecting it meaning to will and shall. And then your kids say, well, what about could? There's no L in can. You're right. I would have to look at them all online, but my theory is that we already had would and could in our language. I mean, sorry, would and should, and that when could came in, they said, well, it sounds like should and would, let's spell it the same way. We would get in spelling by analogy. We see some of the connections in things like the CH and teach connecting to the GH and taught, the same in catch and caught. So looking for those connections as much as possible, because it's really about the orthographic mapping. Remember that interactive back and forth between letters and sounds. We have to be able to segment the sounds of wells and sounds of words and connect them to their symbols. And this is going to follow that same process, regardless of how transparent that sound symbol connection is. And I'm just going to bring this up, remember, as a reminder, remember the orthographic mapping piece. Okay, I do have some teaching tips, and then I have one little exercise for us before we close out. Multiple exposures. And again, I want to change that word now that I think about it. I don't know the right word for it, so if you have an idea, please put it in the chat box. But what I really want to say is multiple opportunities to engage with and use and write, read and write. So when I say exposure, you need to read it and write it and use it. So that's really the key piece. Interactions, I like that, Rachel. I will write that one down. Multiple interactions with it. Multisensory, again, that's that writing, teaching reading through writing. We need to be helping our kids connect that. I saw so many examples. What you were talking about is how is it made in the mouth? Let's make sure how is it written. Teaching a small set and then build it.
Tomorrow. Thanks for SBA help.
You're welcome, Emily. When we say teaching a small set, start small, but get to making words as quickly as possible. So start with a vowel and a few consonants. Whether it be A is probably one of the more common, or I and E, they're a little bit harder. I usually wait on E, but A would be a good one to start with. And a few consonants, start making words as quickly as possible so they can be seeing this application and how these letters work together to make words. Starting with the easiest, going to more difficult, most common to less difficult. So our last thing that we're going to do, and you can either, two options. One, we're going to do a full, let's do them together rather than break up because it's less stressful for everyone if we're working together. Okay. We're going to go back to our structured literacy Jamboard, and you'll see I did move our I can see nothing's coming into the parking lot. I did move our structured literacy overview here just as a reminder for us. So I'm going to keep that as number 4. But then number 5 is statistics. Remember, I've been saying several times tonight, it's all about statistics. Which one of these are not allowable? And there are several. So in the first line, I can see 1, 2, 3, based on our conversations we've been talking about. In the second line, I can see 1, 2. In the third, I see 1, 2, 2. So let's see what your thoughts are. Put it into the chat box, unmute. You can, I see many of you are on the Jamboard. You can circle them there. Let's talk about which ones are not allowable and why. All right, Jill's saying the double F there. Why, Jill? What's wrong with that? You're muted.
I can't unmute when I'm annotating.
Okay, we can draw it here for you.
So anyway, it was just the double F can't start at the beginning of a word.
Double F's come at the end of the word right after a short vowel. All right, someone else. We've gotten 1 from this row. Like I said, there are 2 more. Oh, we've got somebody anonymous. Who's thank you, Lori. The NG we don't do at the beginning. Exactly. Streege, Mackenzie, what's wrong with Streege?
Too many vowel teams.
We don't need that extra E. And we've got an extra E. Now, granted, that one, meh. We don't need those.
Yep.
Someone's doing the double I. We don't do a double I. With one exception. Brenda, do you know actually 2 exceptions? And they're not English words.
No, I don't.
Hawaii. Skiing.
Oh,
Mackenzie's got skiing. Hawaii, skiing, and I think Caribbean has 2 I's, if I remember correctly. Again,
never-
not English.
those. Yeah, Hawaii.
And Hawaiian. Lori has the GF, like in, which one, Lori, was that? Where's the GF? I missed that one. Skagful, it's a weird one. Skagful. I'm not sure what's exactly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Lori. I'd have to go back to what Louis, I think it was from Louisa Moats that this came from.
What about Scrooge? Is it supposed to be a D? If it's supposed to be a short vowel for
Mhm.
DGE?
Yep. We'd just like we had the Stige and the Scrooge, the DGE comes at the end of a word right after a short vowel. I agree with you, Lori. It is awkward, skagful. It's something that we probably wouldn't do. But as far as a writing, I'm not sure if it's something that we. Thank you for calling the explanation of the is that a Okina or Okina between the eyes? All right, we've got screech, so we've got that because actually that one's okay. Because remember, TCH comes at the end of a word right after a short vowel. This is not a short vowel, so you would definitely use the CH on that one.
But what about the K? Because the,
Yep, there you go. I
K.
missed that part. Yes.
yeah,
Thanks, Tammy. That's what happens when it's the end of the day. And remember what I said about everyone giving each other and ourselves grace, right?
and asteroid, the OY is an ending OI. OI should be if it's in the middle.
Yes, remember I said that Y and I play the same role.
What's wrong with the K in Screech?
It would be an SCR. rather than an
Because why?
It's the CK rule. So if a K is followed by A, O, U, or a consonant, it's made by a C. The K has to be followed by I, E, or Y for it to be a K.
Oh, like skunk is right with a K, right?
Yep, skunk. Well, and the SK combination comes from Norse. So like a skirt and a skunk and skill, and those are the old Norse words. But if you have a vowel like that in screech, that's an old English, and we would use an SR word as well. But I mean the SCR, it's the C versus K, and Tammy's right. It's what comes after the K if it's a vowel sound, like the K, you say skunk. And again, I don't want to look that up. I think that comes up to us from, I would say Native American even with skunk, but that the SK combination is an Old Norse one. Like in
Well, and
skull.
also
Mhm.
the SK is typically an ending blend also instead of a beginning blend too. With the exception of skunk. I know you're gonna get me on that one, but
Well, that's where again, I would say, let's look it up. Let's go to Adam online and find, what is skunk from? Because as this is where we get curious and think what's the origin of this? And when did it come in? So it's North American Algonquin language. So when they came into the language, they look at it and it's like, okay, how do we figure out how to spell it? If I'm gonna spell SC, SK at this point, whatever it's gonna make the most sense. So, and in fact, I think it was, let's see if even in their D, I'm looking for any kind of reference to if it was ever spelled with a C. I think it was, not Edgar Allan Poe, the other one. Oh, come on, the American author who wrote Huckleberry Finn, really blanking on his name, Samuel Clemens. Anyway, he said, poor is the man who can only spell things one way. So it could be, but the thing is, do we normally do it? There's one we haven't gotten yet.
Steak? I don't know.
Sorry, you're right. Two we haven't gotten because CK comes at the end of the word right after a short vowel. So if it were stack, yes.
crock.
The exact same reason. CK comes at the end of the word right after a short vowel. A lot of practice requires, doesn't it? Colleen's saying that there are examples like Trek. Again, I want to know the language origin of that because in fact, I did see reference to that recently. In a video I was watching. In fact, I think it was the one I was watching just this afternoon. Old High German, Middle Low German came from Trekken. Afrikaans, that's what the reference was. And that actually was in this video I was watching just this afternoon. And I'm going to pause it so I can get it for you, or at least quiet it. There we go. This is Alison Clark from Australia. And she's a speech pathologist, and I love her videos. And I just found this one this afternoon, and it totally fits to what we're talking about. Fun spelling facts for grown-ups. And notice how she says spelt instead of spelled. She's Australian, but she is where I learned that Trek, she used exactly that example. And that, as she said, came into our language from Afrikaans. So this is another fun video that I recommend. Okay, we are almost at time. So as far as our closure, I do ask that you put either into the Jamboard or into the chat box whoops, I went too far. A keyword or phrase, an important idea, or some food for thought from the time we've spent together today. I'll put the Jamboard in the chat box again for those of you who don't have it. And if you, like I said, if you want to put it in the chat box, you're to unmute. And we will be seeing you again, hopefully next week on Thursday, May 25th. I will be a year older when I see you next. And I will make sure that, let me grab the chat box for our clock hours for you. If there's anybody who still needs the attendance link. Thank you. Another way around the sun, right? They're always fun. It's better than the alternative. And here's my contact and our resources for you. And I'll make sure that if I can grab those links, copy a link address, I'll put those in the chat for you as well. So have a great evening, a great week. Enjoy the sunshine. I'll put those in for you as well. Oh, the Erica occurrence are so much fun. I really enjoy her book too. When I saw that there was a reference to her book, I said, I have to get that. It's just like the videos in the same kind of tone where she says that you just learn. And she says like, okay, there was a whole chapter called Blame the French. It's like, okay, she's a person after my own heart. I love French. It's my second language, but our English is really, really hard to write because of French. So definitely let's look at relationships. Thank you, Colleen. Appreciate, oh, the Kilpatrick one. Lori, that one's really complex. I usually get people groan about that. So thank you for the appreciation because it is very complex to learn it. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon and we look forward to seeing you next week. I thought that that would take me longer than just to finish out the day, but that's okay. I'm sure you don't mind being done a couple of minutes early. Go ahead, Nina. Is that a raised hand or saying goodbye? All right, thanks. You have a great afternoon.